Where's the mouse? Okay, so she's recording. Right. Okay, everybody, I think we will get started. Hopefully everyone has some pizza. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Chandra Sripada as our MindCORE speaker for today. I was just saying to Dr. Sripada, he, in my mind, truly is the sort of human personification of MindCORE. He has a BA in liberal arts, then he went to medical school, he completed an internship in psychiatry, and then a PhD in philosophy at Michigan. He is the Theophile Raphael Research Professor and Professor of Psychiatry and Philosophy, and he directs the Neuroimaging Methods Core. He has ongoing NIMH-funded projects investigating neural networks underpinning bipolar disorder and the general psychopathology P factor in adolescents, and is a site investigator for the ABCD study at Michigan. And his work is sort of really broadly focused on ethics, moral psychology, agency, self-control. He integrates philosophical thinking and theorizing with the results across these different disciplines of psychology, neuroscience, psychiatry, philosophy. And he's going to talk to us today about the systematic misrepresentation of value in mental disorders. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sripada. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I really, that was such a fabulous introduction. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here at MindCORE and very happy to be talking about a subject. I was told, talk about a big picture. And this is a view that has been brewing in my head for, basically a decade or so. And this is the first time I'll be discussing it. I'm very glad to talk to you all. It's a beautiful day out. Anybody that's here is not representing value correctly, I would say. But I am very glad that you are here. Okay. Technical difficulties. It's not advancing. Is there a keyboard? Oh, there is one. Yeah. Huh. There we go. That worked. Okay. Mental disorder is a normative term. What does normative mean? It means should, ought. It's not descriptive. It's telling you how things should be. And this comes right out of the ICD-9 WHO. Mental disorder is a condition involving inappropriate or maladaptive patterns of thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Those red terms, those are normative. And so the central question for this talk is, what is the source of normativity at work in calling something a mental disorder? And there is one source that is, many people's impression of psychiatry is that the source of normativity importantly depends on norms of deviance and social control. So here's Michel Foucault, Madness and Civilization, saying essentially that the medicalization of mental illness is creating a kind of a normative control structure. And there's powers that lie behind how the shape that control structure takes. Thomas Szasz' famous anti-psychiatry book, Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest that made into a movie. This is David Rosenhan's famous paper in Science on being sane in insane places, where about 10 pseudo patients fake their way into mental hospitals, but then were sane thereafter. And the claim was that they were all assigned serious mental illness disorder categories and given powerful psychotropic medications. And then here's John Fryer, Dr. Henry Anonymous in 1972 at the APA. He was a gay physician, and he was actually at the University of Pennsylvania for his residency. So maybe a blemish on the program is that they did ask him to leave when he came out back then. And so there is something to this idea that there are norms of social control that play a role in psychiatry. And yet, I don't think that encompasses the most important source of normativity. Another major source of normativity is norms of malfunctioning. Cars have parts: carburetors, pistons, steering wheels, brakes. Bodies have parts: hearts, lungs, kidneys, intestines. The mind has parts: the mood system, attention system, threat processing system. And so the claim goes, well, just like a carburetor or kidney can be broken or malfunction, so too can the mood system, attention system, and so on. So probably the most widely known, most influential account of mental disorders, Jerome Wakefield's. Mental disorders involve harmful dysfunction. And how do you know something's broken? Wakefield says, you look to the natural selection history of that system. Well, that's going to be challenging. It's very hard to get functions from natural selection that way. What's the function of the mood system? Keep people in the middle, not too sad, not too happy? It's not right. What's the function of the attention system? Pay attention to the right things? Any attempt to specify these things more clearly just ends up looking unsatisfying and circular. And I will note also that even Wakefield acknowledges that's not enough. And he's got a second source of normativity in his account. He says it needs to be harmful, and that just takes us back to social norms, because he doesn't have a really clear account of what harmful means. So these are important frameworks, but I don't think they're going to be enough. Here's an alternative source of normativity that has almost never been discussed in the philosophy of psychiatry. Here's a GPS map. You are here. You're driving along and you need to go to the hospital. Maybe a passenger in the car needs urgent medical attention. And so the GPS says the hospital's there. Unbeknownst to you, the hospital is there. This map, this GPS map is misrepresenting. And we all get immediately, there's something inappropriate or maladaptive about a misrepresenting map. And you might call this, for shorthand, map normativity. My claim is that this is the type of normativity at work in all genuine mental disorders. Map normativity. It's the map of an internally representing map that is inaccurate by which the individual is steering. So a lot more needs to be said to unpack this, and that's the goal of the remainder of the talk. And the talk has three parts. I'll talk about the valuational revolution in cognitive neuroscience, then I'll give a misvaluation account of mental disorder, and I'll talk about the advantages of this account. And like I said, this is the first time I'm presenting this account, so if I'm wrong, you'll let me know. I was told not to move away from here because people can see me here and it's being recorded, but my natural instinct is to walk around. So that's why you'll see me catch myself and come back. Okay, so the first part. There has been a valuational revolution in cognitive neuroscience, and I'll tell you, foreshadow a bit. It's one that places maps, valuational maps, at center stage in everything that unfolds in our mental life, or many important things. Let me start with the first component of the valuationist model as I understand it. The model is decisionist. Decisionist means all the things you do with your body and mind arise from ongoing rapid decisions or moments of choice. Think about this carefully. Take a temporally extended type of unfolding chunk of agency, making coffee. Well, you're going to go through rapid decisions. You're going to look for the coffee pot. Where do you look? You're going to add coffee and water. How much do you add? You're going to select a mug. Which one? These are rapidly unfolding choices that constitute your temporally unfolding agency. Even internal mental actions, the paradigmatic one being deliberation. For any philosophers in the audience, philosophers call this practical reasoning. And this is scaffolded by the kind of rapid choices that I'm describing. You bring to mind a consideration relevant to the overall deliberating the topic of deliberation. Which considerations? Do you stay on this, or do you discard it rapidly and move on and dwell on more important considerations? Those are decisions you're making. You keep on bringing considerations to mind. When do you stop? More decisions. And then, of course, there's a kind of a pooling at the end of deliberation, and you make a choice. Okay, so decisionism is the first premise of valuationism. Here's the second. Once you've broken agency into decisional units, you need an explanation of how agents select among the options at these decisional units. And when you ask ordinary folk, what happens at these, or when you get them to understand that there are these moments of choice occurring, how are those moments of choice settled? What is the basis? My sense is, so, if I flash Fritos or Lay's sour cream and Child's potato chips. Very quickly, and I say, make a choice. You'll make a choice. And if you're rational, you'll pick these. These are fantastic. If these get brought into the house, I eat the whole bag. I can't stop. They're so good. If you ask the ordinary people, they'll think, well, something's going on in my head. There's like an internal chooser there that is making the choice. But this is homuncular. That's not a mechanistic explanation of what's really going on. And we do know what's really going on. What's really going on looks like this. I'm going to depict these mentally represented valuational maps in these circles with these Gaussian humps with the scalar, internally represented scalar quantity, which represents the expected value of the respective options. And in kind of classic nomenclature, I'll use a circle for a decision node. The actions emanate here, and here are your options, and that lightning means you chose that. Here's what happens, and we understand this from lots of different convergent directions in cognitive neuroscience. Your mind has represented scalar valuational quantities that are represented in your head attaching to the options. They enter into decision, and then you make your choice. Okay, so decisions are made on the basis of expected value. I want to make clear, I started with an analogy, but I want to kick that away. The GPS map is an external map that you access slowly and serially. This is not like that. This mentally represented map is something already inside your head. And from the inside, these value representations are experienced subjectively, affectively, as a positive glow or a negative sting. You go, like that. And then the chooser doesn't, this is not conceptual thoughts. So these are not propositional attitudes in the philosophy talk. You don't say, Lay's chips will yield more crispiness and saltiness, thereby affording me more satisfaction. That would have been funny if I did it in kind of a British accent, and then you'd be like, No, this is not what is happening. Instead, it's a quick momentary decision that we are acquainted with on the inside throughout whenever we engage in agency, these kinds of decisions are occurring. Okay, so these are the momentary decisions, basic decisions that I have in mind. Okay, that's the second component of the model that I call valuationism. At each decision node, you represent the expected value of options, and you select the action with higher value. No homunculi, no inner chooser. Things are done on the basis of expected value. Here's the third element, and I won't even discuss. So you say to yourself, well, where do these expected value representations come from? That's its own thing, and it's not really the topic of this talk. So people may be familiar with frameworks like temporal difference reinforcement learning, or planning as inference, or predictive processing. There's an abundance of frameworks about how the expected value representations are calculated. The only thing I will say is, generally the form of these algorithms is they are predictionist. What does that mean? It means that these valuational states are non-basic. Their semantics is something like this. They are predictions of the satisfaction of the more basic states. So there is some kind of, all the algorithms demand that some fundamental states exist that carry value intrinsically. And they may be things like pleasure, nourishment, health, safety, friendship. Martin Seligman has an acronym, PERMA, for what those things are. And conveniently, he sits right here. That's very convenient. All right. So decisionism, valuationist choice, and predictionism. Those are the components of valuationism. Why should you believe it? There's an abundance of evidence. I'll go through it very quickly, but this is not a talk defending valuationism. It's a talk about something else, but I'll go through some of the evidence. We know a bunch of things about the valuationist architecture. Where are the valuational maps represented in the brain? Well, this is a great study by Joe Cable, sitting right there. This is great. Many of the luminaries I cite just happen to be sitting right here. Yeah. How are the valuational maps translated into action? So this is something my lab spends a lot of time on. This is a sequential sampling model. It's how valuation gets translated into choice. And we have a great understanding of that. How are valuational maps acquired? So there's great studies that show, you present stimuli to subjects. These are arbitrary Japanese characters given to Western subjects. They see the stimuli and they're rewarded. And over time, they learn an appropriate valuational map. And what are the basic aims that humans tend to have? There's theories about that. I want to also talk about where we see this valuationist architecture. And in short, I'm going to go through this in 2 slides. The answer is everywhere. You see it in economic choices for food, material goods, money, social outcomes. You see it in sequential bodily actions. So theories of habits and other sequential motoric behaviors. Valuationism is the preeminent framework. Sequential mental actions, things like accessing working memory, which happens during deliberation, things like this is the expected value of control model due to Cohen and Shenov and other theorists. So things like cognitive control, executive control, that's evaluationist according to contemporary models. Here are some things where evaluation that are non-obvious. So people are familiar with pop-out effects in attention. That is salient due to its unique color relative to the other things in the array. Contemporary theory, this is an integrated priority map. Contemporary theory sees attention allocation as a valuationist phenomenon. Here's another domain. We've done a bunch of studies on spontaneous thought. We have talk aloud protocols and we fit machine learning algorithms to the data. We, as well as others, understand spontaneous thought to be a kind of foraging decision process. And so here's the individual's past and their future. Here's the negative axis and the positive axis. And we can see, we propose the generative process for serial spontaneous thought is valuationist. I'll do one more. Emotions create an action tendency. This is universally agreed upon. In any case, emotion theorists in psychology and in philosophy talk about the action tendency. The action tendency is best understood in valuationist terms. When you see a bear, the fear state is activated and the valuational map rapidly changes from staying having higher value prior to that to, of course, getting out of there having higher value. Okay, so valuationism. Interim summary, valuationist model of human agency says every instance of agential activity, everything that the agent ever does with their mind or their body is done on the basis of value representations. It involves decisionism, valuationist choice, and predictionism, and encompasses all domains, essentially. It's a very general, kind of totalizing picture of where mental activity comes from. All right, I'll continue to the next part of the talk. Now that we have the valuationist picture on the table, that's where I'm going to start talking about misvaluation being a central feature of mental disorder. Okay. So recall, I had this picture over here. A very clear sense of how a map can misrepresent. This map says the hospital's there, hospital's here. In fact, we have a good sense of how external entities, be they sentences in a natural language or maps, can misrepresent. What about valuation maps? Can they misrepresent? Yes, they definitely can. So here's the person's aims that I'm just stipulating. How do I know it? Well, I'm stipulating the ground truth. So the person's aims that are that health is much, much more important than pleasure from crispy, savory snacks. Maybe they vowed on Monday that they are going to avoid salty treats and do what the doctor said and eat more healthy vegetables. But it's Tuesday, they're at the office, and they have a craving for the salty snacks. There's a bunch of processes that operate in your psychology. I call them broadly distorting factors. I'll say more about them in a moment, but I'm not talking about the etiology of misrepresentation. I'm just saying conceptually, can it happen? Yes. This is a misrepresenting evaluative map. It put much more value on the Lay's potato chips than on the carrot. And this individual, unless they are exercising executive control to modify this, is poised to choose the Lay's potato chips. I just want to keep on emphasizing this point. this is not a false belief. This is not a propositional attitude that the individual has. This is a map that is misrepresenting. A better description of the internal phenomenology of what's going on here, it's a quasi-perceptual evaluative illusion. The individual sees value in the potato chip, and doesn't see it in the carrot, even though by stipulation, their underlying core basic aims, which are not things that fluctuate on a day-to-day basis, put a higher value on health than pleasure. Okay, more examples of misvaluation. It can happen in attention. So this is a very common paradigm used in research studies. There's a distractor over here, but the experimenter's instructions are to find the black circle. The subject is getting paid for accuracy on the experiment. They want to find the black circle, but their evaluative internal integrated priority map, which is the basis for rapid attention allocation, has put more value there. That's a misrepresentation. So the classic phenomenon is the individual looks in the wrong place or is at least delayed in looking at the right place. Here is another example of a misrepresentation. This map, given a reasonable understanding of a person's underlying aims, this map is an appropriate reaction to the presence of a bear. So I'm afraid of dogs. So when my mother-in-law brings over the dog and my little 4-year-old puts her hand out, to get her hand licked by the dog, I can't do that. Instead, this is what my valuational map looks like when that little dog is there. And I'm poised to run away unless, something else intervenes. Okay, good. So here's the general form of what misrepresentations of values look like. They involve a structure where the person's underlying aims. And so, by the way, how do we know that the aims are like that? For economists, this is a big deal because they have the revealed preference framework and they don't let you deviate too much from the behavioral data. We are not economists here. We are neuroeconomists. And neuroeconomists get to stipulate things about the ground truth because they're interested in the mechanistic processes, not necessarily in fitting behavioral data. So the aims of this individual are A is favored over B, but various factors intervene in virtue of which their valuational map puts higher value on B relative to A, and they inappropriately perform a B promoting action. What are the distorting factors? Well, in a word, when people talk about the etiology of mental disorders or the etiology of ordinary irrationality, those etiologies are broad and diverse. They encompass things like moods, emotions, cravings, temperamental factors like negativity bias, novelty bias. In what the great Aaron Beck, another University of Pennsylvania luminary, called inaccurate schemas and distorted automatic thoughts. So there is a wide variety, and I could have added crossing levels, which I want to be careful to do as a philosopher, neurobiological individual differences, although more nuance needs to be said there. In any case, there is a very wide set of factors that can play the role of distorting factors. And so there's no mystery that aims could be set up like this and valuational maps would be misrepresenting relative to those aims. Okay, so that was misvaluation. I'm now going to say a little bit briefly about what it means for misrepresentation of value to be significant and systematic. We don't care about all misrepresentations. There may be a false sentence in some book that sits in somebody's library. That's not a catastrophe from the standpoint of normativity. What is bad is like this situation. The passenger needs medical attention, needs to get to the hospital, and this map is misrepresented. So a heuristic for when a misrepresentation is significant is, well, how much value is lost due to steering by that misrepresentation, or how much value would be gained if the misrepresentation were corrected? That's when a misrepresentation is significant. When is it systematic? It's systematic when it arises from a stable feature of the person's psychology. That's actually what I'm calling a distorting factor. A distorting factor is something that produces systematic misrepresentations, not a one-off event. It's actually what Aaron Beck was talking about as well. you know, in his, he had a 1963 paper in Archives of General Psychiatry, now called JAMA Psychiatry, where he characterizes depressive cognition. And it's just a series of systematic misrepresentations, is how he describes it. So he is the first psychiatrist to really get on this idea of misrepresentation being a central element in psychiatry. Although he clearly acknowledges his debt to Stoic philosophy and Buddhist philosophy, where and more in classical philosophy in general, where misrepresentation, illusion, ignorance are much more central features. Whereas in modern philosophy, notions like compulsion, freedom, and ability are much more central notions. Okay, a little bit of a deep historical tangent, but it kind of adds some nuance to the view. Okay, so we now know what significant and systematic misrepresentation is. So with all this background, remember, this was, you know, essentially the title, All Genuine Mental Disorders Involve Significant Systematic Misrepresentations of Value. Now I'm in a position with all that infrastructure to really delve into this and try to establish this claim. Okay, recall our central question. What is the source of normativity of mental disorders? These are value-laden terms over here, inappropriate and maladaptive. I said that valuationism is the thesis that thoughts, emotions, and behaviors all arise from valuational maps. We also know that these valuational maps can be inaccurate, and that's actually a source of normativity, map normativity. Okay, so this is the account. What makes thoughts, emotions, and behaviors inappropriate or maladaptive in mental disorders is that they arise from significantly and systematically inaccurate valuational maps. Just bringing together this notion of normativity and this type of normativity that emerges from maps. Let's go to some examples. Okay, ADHD. So I directed an adult ADHD clinic at the University of Michigan. And so very, very familiar with this phenomenon. So a hallmark of ADHD is distractibility. It can be externally oriented, or it can be internally oriented, the phenomenon of mind wandering. So by stipulation, this young lady, she needs to pay attention to this lecture to pass the class and reach her dream of becoming a doctor. So the aims are set up. So lecture needs to be the highest value. We are all familiar with this though. The birds are at that window chirping, and that's a distraction. And she's got some thoughts meandering through her mind that periodically she disengages from the lecture, looks at the birds, and is engaged in mind wandering. Why is that happening? This is what her valuational map looks like. Inappropriately, at times, bird has higher expected value and mind wandering has higher expected value than lecture. And those are misrepresentations. And we can ask, why is this map misrepresented? And then we get into a bunch of theories of ADHD and the etiology of ADHD and the role of the norepinephrine system and all different kinds of things like that. Okay. So distractibility is very well understood in terms of misrepresenting evaluative maps. Let's keep going. Depression. Hallmark of depression is amotivation. A depressed man previously enjoyed playing soccer with his son and poker with his friends. That's what his evaluational map looked like before. His current evaluative map, because he's depressed, looks like that. He hasn't stopped loving or caring for his son. He hasn't stopped caring for his friends or the seeking of meaningful social relationships and the enjoyment thereof. This is a misrepresentation of value. And postulating that his aims have changed, he doesn't care for his son anymore, he doesn't care for social, is deeply inconsistent with a wealth of data that suggests the problem lies at the level of valuational maps and not at fundamental basic aims. For example, as long as the depression is mild or moderate, this individual will typically self-present with ego-dystonic descriptions. That means he doesn't like the way that his behavior is. And that is inconsistent with his aims changing. He's puzzled because his aims have not changed, but his valuations have changed, leading him to for example, stay in bed rather than do those things. Okay. I want to very quickly mention that leading theories of why this kind of misvaluation occurs, such as the momentum tracking account due to Iran Eldar and Yael Niv's group at Princeton and Rob Rutledge and folks like that, are that not only do algorithms track the expected value of options, they're tracking a latent variable of the fecundity of the environment vis-a-vis your current expected value representations. Sounds a little cryptic, but what I am saying is that under certain circumstances, algorithms track more complicated and more risky things about the environment. And these algorithms modify large populations of valuations, sometimes appropriately, which is why we have those algorithms, but it can be inappropriate when these algorithms functioning to do what they were evolutionarily selected to do, sometimes they misfire. It's just a statistical property of the algorithms leading to this kind of situation. I bring that up just to, again, say, looking at norms of malfunctioning to deliver normativity to psychiatry is implausible. Okay, because these algorithms that created that are doing exactly what they were evolutionarily selected to do. That is, track the momentum of the environment. Okay. Here's another example, negative rumination. In our studies of people's spontaneous thoughts, many individuals are like this, kind of many neutral thoughts, kind of prospective. The family's coming up. It'll be nice to see my sister. Got to make sure to. Yeah, we understand that. And then if you look at levels of the trait neuroticism, individuals high on neuroticism, which is neuroticism, by the way, is a central vulnerability factor for depression and anxiety. Their thoughts will be like this. I was sitting alone in the dining hall. Nobody wanted to come to my table. People were looking at me. Their thoughts are on and on like this. That's a negativity bias. And you can conceptualize, where do thoughts come from? Well, our theory is, along with others, there's maps, much like external attention assigns a value to every spatial location, and where you saccade to is dependent on that spatial valuational map. There's an internal mnemonic valuational map that is putting valuational weight on broadly things from the past, things to the future, positive things and negative things. In these individuals, that mnemonic valuational map has a tall peak on threats in the future and failures in the past. And it's reasonable to believe that this represents a kind of misrepresentation. It's not good from the perspective of the person's own aims to be stuck right there. Okay. All right, last example of a mental disorder that is well analyzed by valuational maps. I've written a lot about addiction, and one of the things that I'm at pains to do in this work is identify multiple convergent lines of evidence that a picture of addiction, which involves overpowering desires, the individual fights as hard as they can against these addictive urges, but those desires are compulsive, is a very poor fit to the empirical database. Instead, what we have a picture of, and this is a figure taken from my recent review in behavioral and brain research. Individuals have ongoing automatic thoughts in the way that Aaron Beck and many contemporary theorists believe. And based on these thoughts and various other things, they form evaluative maps in an ongoing way about using drugs and not using drugs. They make decisions, and those decisions eventuate in actions. If you believe in the compulsive desire picture, everything up to here is fun, but there are these overpowering desires that come in and shift the person's behavior. And that's not at all what happens. Instead, individuals with addictions, so Aaron Beck identified the cognitive triad, the distortions involving the self, the environment, and the future. Those are ubiquitous in addiction. There's also various neurophysiological changes that also lead to direct misvaluation of the drug, the kind of things that Kent Berridge and Terry Robinson talk about, University of Michigan researchers, more at the neurobiological level. So if a person thinks that they themselves are unworthy, their future is bleak in a distorted way, that their coping skills are absent, and there's neurophysiological also hypervaluation of the drug, these all converge to create higher value on using drugs versus not using drugs. And the individual makes a volitional choice to use drugs. That's the etiology of how individuals end up relapsing, for example, after a period of sobriety. This is best understood in terms of valuational maps, or misvaluation. All right. The more general claim of the misvaluational account. So is this view that I'm offering, is it falsifiable? Yeah. There would be lots and lots of what I call core symptoms in mental illness that are not analyzable as misvaluation. My challenge is, let's try to find them. Now, I want to make clear, not all symptoms of mental disorders are misvaluations. Some are what I call knock-on effects. So I analyzed negative rumination, which is a hallmark of depression and anxiety, in misvaluational terms. But a knock-on effect of negative rumination is poor sleep. Poor sleep is not a misvaluation. It's a consequence of a misvaluation. So what I am saying is that mental disorders involve a cluster of co-occurring symptoms, a network, if you will, in psychology talk, a causal homeostatic cluster in philosophy talk. At the core of this network are misvaluations. The misvaluations are the essential feature that render the resulting cluster a mental disorder as opposed to something else. Okay. Let me go through. I see I'm running low on time, so I will make this quick. What I think is the prime argument for the misvaluation account of mental disorder. So if there's any argument that I want you to consider carefully, it's this one. Consider some putative core symptom of mental disorder, call it S. Definitionally, S must be inappropriate or maladaptive in some way. We're talking about a mental disorder, so its symptoms must have normativity. Suppose S does not arise from a misrepresentation of value. That is, in exhibiting S, the agent's valuation map is accurate. It's a supposition. An accurate valuation map is one that correctly represents how the agent's options fare in terms of aim satisfaction. That's the thesis that I called predictionism earlier. Valuation maps represent aim satisfaction. Okay, so from in 1 and 2, we conclude, thus in doing S based on an accurate valuation map, what the agent does best satisfies their own aims. An accurate valuation map is one that the resulting options are best aim satisfied. Okay, but if in doing S, what the agent does best satisfies their own aims, who are we to call that S, that symptom? Inappropriate or maladaptive? Seems deeply unintuitive. It seems like we've arrived at a kind of a social control picture, if that's what we say. And so to avoid this conclusion, our supposition over here must be false. S does arise from a misrepresentation of value. The failure to make, or put it this way, making this kind of supposition gives us a deeply implausible picture of what a mental disorder is. Okay. What are some advantages of this account? So I will take a few more minutes and then I will wind up. Okay. The misvaluation account, I claim, gives us a better account of the normativity of mental disorder. If psychiatry involves just social control, that's unacceptable. I wouldn't be a psychiatrist if I actually believed that. Malfunctioning is underspecified and unworkable. No theorist has been able to say what that really is. The misvaluation account appeals to what philosophers will call thin normativity. An agent who acts on the basis of inaccurate valuation maps hinders the achievement of their own goals and aims. And that's a problem for the agent, but it's also a problem for us. This kind of normativity gives an entryway for why therapeutic intervention is sometimes necessary, sometimes even if the agent superficially says, I don't want that intervention. John Stuart Mill, in his, I think, 1859 book on liberty, there is no bigger defender of liberty than John Stuart Mill, gives a very clear example of somebody who is about to cross a damaged bridge. And he says, you can stop them. You can stop them because they may not know their map is potentially misrepresenting. You can stop them in order to correct that misrepresentation. So it's a very deep and powerful strand of normativity that says misrepresenting maps are a defensible case where intervention is appropriate. Okay. The misvaluation account explains what's distinctly mental about mental disorders. Here's a broken bone, here's a heart attack, here's major depression. They're all harmful dysfunctions, if you can even make that account work. Only this one is a mental disorder, I would say, because it involves a significant and systematic misrepresentation of values. These could never be mental disorders because they don't have valuation. They're not representing anything. Okay. The misvaluation account clarifies the boundaries of mental disorders. So in writing about addiction, I'm familiar with the phenomenon of rational addiction. There are individuals, difficult and precarious circumstances, limited economic resources, unsatisfying job, limited social supports. Drugs give them hedonic effects, mood regulation, diversion, community with others. Such an individual has a valuational map that looks like this. If that's the valuational map, we shouldn't call this a mental disorder, even if they meet DSM criterion such as tolerance and withdrawal. So there's a very fine boundary between genuine addiction and what I'm calling here rational pseudo addiction. That boundary is the accuracy versus inaccuracy of the individual's valuational map. Okay. Last point I make, the misvalue, and this is a deep point. I'm giving this talk in a couple of days in University of Virginia. I don't want the upshot of this talk to be individuals are to blame for their inaccuracies. These things are inaccurate. Oh, these individuals are to blame. They're making big time errors. Therefore, the mentally ill are individuals we should criticize. If that's the upshot, that's not at all my intention. Misrepresenting evaluational maps, interestingly, if genuinely they are present, they are ones that the individual, it's impossible for them to be responsible for. That's a strong claim. Okay, why do I say that? Well, there's a very deep regress argument for how individuals could be responsible for those. Let's look at it. I'll give you a flavor of how that argument goes. So here's this individual. She's in class. She's supposed to be looking at the lecture, but the valuational map is misrepresented. Okay, by hypothesis, that's true. There's a philosophical thesis that if you act on the basis of a false representation, it's called acting under ignorance. That's a prima facie excuse for moral responsibility and blame. It's one of the most powerful excuses from responsibility and blame. Now, there's a caveat. You might still have what's called derived responsibility for failing at a prior time to correct the false representation. It's not like you can act under a false representation and you're off the hook. Then people would create circumstances where they act under a false representation and they would get off scot-free. If you created the situation where you act under a false representation, you're still on the hook. But how can an individual create this problem? Well, the natural thought is, well, there's some correction action, call it executive control correction, by which they could have fixed this misvaluating representation here. Okay, but that prior correction action arises from its own valuational map. If they didn't do the correction action, then the expected value over here is higher on do not correct versus correct. Well, that means that this is a misrepresenting valuational map. We said that this is a misrepresenting valuational map. That means correction should have been done. Correction was not done. That means the valuational map looks like that. And if correction should have been done, then this is a misrepresenting valuational map. But I just said you can't have responsibility for doing something based on a misrepresenting valuational map. So this can't be the basis of derived responsibility. That's a misrepresentation over here. So we have to go You see this as a regress. This is a vicious regress. It's not fixable. So if this is a genuinely misrepresenting valuational map, we have very powerful reasons to believe that the individual is protected from blame, at least for the irrationality of what they do in the circumstance. There's a lot of nuance here. I'm not saying that people in these circumstances should not seek treatment. If they fail to abide by treatment, they're off the hook. There's a lot of nuance in the overall picture, but there's an entryway for understanding a deep connection between mental illness and moral responsibility by thinking of it in these, the philosophical term is doxastic. We move away from thinking about responses and think about representational phenomena. That's the correct way to think about responsibility in mental illness. Doxasticize the picture. Okay, concluding summary. We're after this question, what is the normativity in mental disorder? We found map normativity is a powerful form of normativity that has not been invoked. We also found neuroeconomics, the valuational revolution, delivers maps throughout our mind as the basis of mental phenomena. That led to the misvaluational account that I applied to these conditions. And the advantages of the account are solid, defensible normative foundation, explains what's distinctively mental about mental disorders, clarifies boundaries, and gives us a rich appreciation of why mental disorder is tied to excuse for moral responsibility. Okay. Thank you. Question.
You made a distinction between your evaluation with the malfunction.
Yes.
And you did appeal to your evidence that your evaluation is based on your mechanism of co-evaluation.
Yeah.
Then an understanding the way that basically you have misrepresented that map is because of dysfunctional evaluation system. In which case reduces your account back to the
Good. Yeah. And so I think that's a terrific insight. And I think it opens up a bunch of questions about evolutionary functions that take us into the weeds of that debate. But let me give an example that may give an intuition for my position. We know that you're familiar when you go to the grocery store, there's a mat that when you step on, the door opens. And that mat was created so that when a weight is there, the door will open. And usually the reason why it was created and put there as an artifact is because it's really helpful and people with grocery bags can get in. Now, let's say that some heavy, reasonably heavy object like a box accidentally falls on the mat. The door will open. Now, I would say that the mat is not malfunctioning. The mat is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But there are conditions in which that mat will inevitably misfire. So we want to distinguish what is properly called malfunctioning from a misfiring of a mechanism that is a fairly inevitable part of its evolutionarily selected, or in this case, intentionally selected profile. So I would say the valuational system is not malfunctioning in many of these cases. It is misfiring. And that's exactly the kind of map accuracy captures that idea of a misfire. Okay, good. Do you want to take that? Because I'm not sure the order. Yeah, you take. You pick.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think you can pick, and then if anyone asks questions on Zoom, I can relay them. But...
Oh yeah, but I'm not keeping track of who's the order thing.
Oh, I see. I
yeah.
Either, but Joe, you go first. So your hand up, and I'll pay attention after that.
I wonder, I want to push you a little bit to defend what you're calling predictionism.
Yeah.
Because as I see it, that's really the crux of where you might differ from, say, a standard economist/rational choice theorist. Because in my view, like a standard economist/rational choice theorist would have, these other things, but they would say, there's no way for me to know what someone's aims are or what makes them happy. All I can observe is that they choose, and as long as they have an underlying, as long as they have a map right? Like as long as there, there is a map that exists,
Yeah.
I'm going to say that's their map of value, and they're choosing according to value. So, my normative claims are all going to be with response to what maximizes the map given the choices.
Good.
And it seems like your deviation really comes from that predictionism that's key in your argument.
It is.
So it seems like that's going to have to be defended, and part of the defense is, sometimes people choose things that they don't like, right? You get negative prediction errors. The economists don't like that because they think, well, if you say you don't like it, but that's cheap talk. I'm just going to pay attention to what you chose. This is very much, Marty's argument with the economists, right? That like there are other things that we can ask people to see whether they're achieving their goals. But how do you?
Yeah.
It would seem that there's philosophers of rational choice who tried to go down that road and have retreated to, I'm just going to look at choices. So how do you defend sort of predictionism? How do you anchor what somebody's, again, in many points to the talk, you say, I'm going to stipulate that your aim is this.
Yeah.
Right? But we need to have that stipulation at some point needs to be anchored to, here's how we know what someone's aims are, absent saying they chose what their aims are, which is what the rational choice.
So that really gets to the heart of the matter. Yeah, and that's great. Why believe predictionism? So, one point that went by fairly quickly is value representations are created via a set of algorithms. And I'm not explaining this to you. I know you already know this, but I'll highlight again for everyone, so we're all on the same page. Things like reinforcement learning framework algorithms, temporal difference reinforcement learning, or let's say planning as inference type framework, or predictive processing framework are the three that I mentioned. No matter what algorithm that we pick from, I'll focus on reinforcement learning because they are the best known and most well developed. The reinforcement learning algorithms, all universal, and it doesn't matter which flavor you pick, they all presuppose a reward function, what they call a reward function. It's not a great name because it's not reward in the same sense of the psychologist, but what it is an intrinsic value function. All of these algorithms operate to transfer value from things that have it intrinsically to things that are predictive of the things that have it intrinsically. So there is an argument from the algorithmic substrates that create expected value representations that there are these basic aims. So that's one way to get at it. And then I would also need an argument that the things that create expected valuation representations can sometimes deviate from what is aims maximizing. And a good example of that phenomenon is the momentum algorithms that I talked about from Emmanuel and Eldar and other. So I didn't do a great job of explaining that, but momentum is a kind of latent variable that the agent is trying to track. So let's say winter tends to come and you built up a summer valuational map. And you start getting, when you go to your usual patches, it's early fall, there's many fewer fruit on the first tree you go to. That's a negative prediction error. The second fruit tree you go to, there's many fewer fruit. You shouldn't go to the third tree with the exact same value function you had before. You need to recognize that the latent state of the environment has changed in a very broad way. So momentum tracking involves rapid changes to a wide variety of value, what I'm calling it a valuative map. But sometimes momentum tracking is statistically perilous. The first two were flukes. So you're going to revise all your evaluative maps downwards, but that's not aim satisfying if it was a fluke. So in this way, we establish convergently that agents have valuational maps, they have basic aims, and their choices can deviate from this perspective. There's a lot more to say because, and I'm glad I'm going to get to meet with you later. I'm going to talk about exactly these issues. The economist's perspective of revealed preference bumps up hard against a view like this. And it's the economist that, in fact, most economists and philosophers that engage with this area, they take revealed preference to be a very soft constraint, and they recognize there's all sorts of cases we get a better fit of the agent's true preference function if we relax the necessity of always their behavior is manifest in their choice. Okay. Yeah.
Great talk. I would just like to know the opinion about the counter hypothesis or alternative hypothesis.
Yes.
See that it's not the misvaluation or misrepresentation of the valuation systems, but then it's the compromisation of the inhibitory system. So, for example, in your ADHD model, it showed there are three variables.
Yeah.
Which has three possible weights. In a case one scenario, when you are able to focus on the lecture, for example, then you're able to inhibit the distraction or the other two variables like bird watching or mind wandering.
Yeah.
But in second scenario, when you're getting distracted, you're not able to suppress those distractions, which is, so what I'm trying to say is the weight of the three models are the same, or three variables are the same. It's just the inability to suppress the other two variables is causing, whatever the outcomes or whatever.
Okay, yeah, the incapacity of the executive system. So, it may be that there is an executive system that is able to quash these and lift that.
Or there's no enhancement, for example. Maybe all the three has whatever the
Okay.
base they have. It's just the quashing of
The quashing. Yeah, exactly. And so you say, well, it's not misvaluation, it's the failure of the executive system.
And sorry, and there is examples or evidence that the prefrontal cortex is doing it has this control system or cognitive control where it is able to control these different variables.
Yeah. I would say that this still lies within the spirit of the misvaluation account, because what makes this a normative problem is the map under which the person acts is inaccurate. Now, there is an etiology that you've supplied, the failure of the executive system to do something. So it's not I don't view that as an alternative to the misvaluation account. It is a fleshing out of the etiology of the primary misvaluation. I would add, though, that current models of executive control appropriately, because there's just so much evidence now, executive intervention in these maps is governed by valuation itself, the expected value of control. There's a cost-benefit calculation that an individual is deploying in exerting executive pressure on that map. And usually what's at issue is not an ability, but this map is misrepresenting the need for executive control. So there's a double sense in which misvaluations still takes center stage, I would say. Okay, thanks for your question.
This is great. This is wonderful. I had a question about how to evaluate the systematicity and at what level of generality we're going to do that evaluation.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about this. My husband is an optimist, and it's great in a lot of ways. But when this goes wrong, it's like he always thinks it's going to take him less time to get somewhere. So he's always like, "There'll be no traffic, and everything will go my way," right? And so he's consistently late because he always thinks that things are just going to go his way. Whereas I'm more of a pessimist, and so I always ruminate, and I'm like, all of the things that go wrong, and I'm almost never late. I'm always like plan way ahead to account for all of these things that go wrong, right? And like overall, I could see that our maps are going to meet the different misrepresentations. And so I was just wondering how you do those kind of evaluations, but it seems like the way that you might, when you're an optimist, yeah, you might end up in some cases having these misrepresentations in situations in which the pessimist might get it right, but overall you might be better off at getting your aims, your fundamental aims.
Right.
Whereas the pessimist. So I was just wondering if these sorts of things might hang together in some way, such that it might be that you have to think about kind of global ways of responding and think this one gets it right more often than this one, as opposed to in the particular sort of case.
Right, right. That's a really good question, and much more needs to be said about how we are going to be able to say that map accuracy is problematic in some individuals versus others. You gave a case where the pessimist gets it right sometimes, the optimist gets it right another. So lapsing into kind of a philosophy talk, I would be contrastive in general in my approach for these evaluations. So where I put things in a objective mode, maps are accurate or not, a more nuanced way of presenting all these points are maps are accurate relative to a psychologically available salient alternative. That would be the standard that we would use. So the optimist and pessimist actually would be neither is better off. And maybe there's a third individual that is far better than these two, the optimist and the pessimist. And that might be a standard for which we would say that there's a systematic deviation from accuracy. Right. So what you're pointing at is a quicker way of specifying these kind of conditions for accuracy that didn't employ the vocabulary of contrastiveness. A deeper reason why contrastiveness is needed is, let's face it, all of our evaluative maps fall so short of accuracy, universally and ubiquitously. So we are not in the business of saying things are objectively accurate versus inaccurate, full stop. We're always in the business of talking about psychologically available alternatives to one's representational profile that are not available for some individuals versus others, accepting that both individuals are strongly, strongly inaccurate relative to a God's eye perspective. Yeah, excellent question. Thanks.
We have a question from Iolette on Zoom, and then so Dr. Ruscio says, "Thank you for your very engaging talk." And then she asked a question. I think I've been spending too much time with her. I've rubbed up with her, so she asked a question I would have also asked. The notion of misvaluation depends heavily on there being a correct valuation map based on the agent's aims and goals. But what if the individual's aims conflict with the aims and well-being of others? For example,
right,
the student with ADHD whose distractibility is misaligned with their aim of doing well in the class in order to reach their dream of being a doctor. But what if the student who just doesn't care about school, whose aim instead is focused on non-academic pursuits, but whose parents and teachers believe that paying attention in class is important for success? Or the case of an individual with antisocial personality disorder whose behavior aligns with their own aims but conflicts with the rights of others. Are these not, in your words, genuine cases of a mental disorder, or do these examples bring us back to the need to include social needs in the definition of mental disorder?
Good. That is a great question. I found every single question here really gets to the heart of the matter, and that's just not like cheap talk. I really appreciate these questions. I do bite a bullet. I'll focus on the antisocial personality disorder because it illustrates this idea vividly. The type of inappropriateness and maladaptiveness that I think is at the heart of mental disorder is relative to one's own aims. And so an individual who is a diabolical, remorseless individual that uses others as means to their own ends, they do not have a misvaluation. Instead, they have accurate valuation of somebody else as an instrument that they can exploit, and they go ahead and exploit them. I think we should criticize such an individual strongly, and we do so through moral criticism. Moral criticism is a species of criticism that is genuine and widespread, and I'm not a skeptic about moral criticism. And so an individual who is antisocial is an apt target for moral criticism. There is no need to go through a detour and say that there is a mental disorder and their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are inappropriate relative to a mental disorder standard. So I think this is actually a positive feature of the view. There are some things that are called a mental disorder currently that should not be. And this crystallizes what's problematic about it. And I see Adrian Reynes here. So the people that I want to engage with about my talk are sitting in this room. And I do believe that he will have an interesting pushback about that, and it's fair.
Tonight, yeah.
Tonight, okay.
Party, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, first, this is a breathtakingly interesting approach.
Oh, thank you, Marty.
Um,
I appreciate that.
And you may have just answered my question, because I was going to try to work through pedophilia through this map. So you've got pedophiles. So at first misrepresentation is better to have sex with children than not at all. And then he goes back to a Frankfurt moment in which he thinks about whether or not he should change his desires. And again, he doesn't.
Yeah.
Would we ever hold him morally responsible, or is this just not a mental disorder?
Yeah, and so I think issues around this particular type of case are so nuanced and fraught. I won't dive headlong into a response there. And a lot of clearing up needs to be done of the type of individual. I mean, pedophilia encompasses a heterogeneous set of underlying psychological realizers, some of whom have different moral and different mental disorder appropriate reactions, some of whom weren't different reactions. I will say that in general, and to answer the flavor of your question, we get in trouble in psychiatry where, for example, issues around paraphilias where homosexuality was at one time placed, we get in trouble if we try to use psychiatry as a blunt instrument for moral agendas. And the thin normativity offered here gives a rock solid foundations for psychiatry that is defensible to even the staunchest anti-psychiatry critics. I wonder if Thomas Zaz were in this audience. Hearing about the neuroeconomic revolution and hearing perhaps credibly that some mental disorders involve misvaluation, maybe even an anti-psychiatrist of that order would say, well, in these kinds of cases, maybe there is a warrant for therapeutic intervention. So I would reconfigure psychiatric practice to remove certain kinds of conditions that traditionally have been a focus in order to put thin normativity of this kind at center stage. And it's amazing how much of psychiatry can be supported on that structure. Almost all of it. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your questions and engagement. So the neuroeconomics part, was that new to you? The valuational revolution?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well, we're going to come and talk.